Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Michael Deli Carpini. I'm the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication here at the University of Pennsylvania. And on behalf of the Annenberg School, the Office of the President of the University of Pennsylvania, the Annenberg Public Policy Center and Kathleen Hall Jamieson, and the Institute for Public Service at the Annenberg School for Communication, I'd like to welcome you all to today's lecture. I'd like to make some special welcomes to a few folks who are here, at the risk of not mentioning everyone who I would like to get a chance to mention, but we'd like to thank Gloria Twine Chisholm and her husband Melvin for being here, members of the Penn Board of Trustees and longtime friends of the Annenberg School, Leslie Crewley, University Secretary, John LaTourette and his wife Audrey from the Annenberg Supporting Trust Trustees, Afaf Melis, Dean of the Penn Nursing School, members of the faculty from other departments around the university, including Barbara Savage, Wendy White, Penn's legal counsel, Gail Levin, director of the Leonore Annenberg Scholarship, Fellowship, and School Fund Program at the Annenberg Public Policy Center and former executive director of the Annenberg Foundation, of course, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center, David Eisenhower, director of the Institute for Public Service, several of our alums, including Bill Boggs, Daniel Lerner, and Bernadette McNulty, and others who have taken the time to join us for today's lecture. As you probably know, today's lecture is part of the combining of two of our most prominent lecture series here at the Annenberg School, the Walter and Leonore Distinguished Lecture in Communication and the Leonore Annenberg Lecture in Public Service and Global Understanding. Both lecture series were designed to honor the Ambassador and Mrs. Annenberg, without whose vision and support this school and this policy center, in addition to a number of major institutions around the world, simply would not exist. So we thank them for that. Speakers for these series have included leaders from the worlds of academia, politics, public policy, and the media, including David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker and author of The Bridge, The Life and Rise of Barack Obama, Andrew Kohut, president of the Pew Research Center, Paul Steiger, editor-in-chief of ProPublica.com, Sashi Tharoor, then the Undersecretary General for Communications at the UN, Barton Gregorian, president of the Carnegie Corporation, the journalist Bill Moyers, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, and most recently Richard Thaler, behavioral economist from the University of Chicago and author of the best-selling book Nudge. Today, we add another deserving name to this prestigious list of speakers. Gwen Ifill is moderator and managing editor of Washington Week, senior correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, author of the 2009 Random House book, The Breakthrough, Politics and Race in the Age of Obama. She's covered 6 presidential campaigns in her career. During the 2008 campaign, she received the George Foster Peabody Award for bringing Washington Week on a 10-city tour. She was the chief congressional and political correspondent for NBC News, White House correspondent for the New York Times. She's reported for the Washington Post, Baltimore Evening Sun, and the Boston Herald American. And she's moderated vice presidential debates, most recently in this year's election. Ms. Ifill is a native of New York City who graduated from Simmons College in Boston. She's the recipient of more than a dozen honorary doctorates, and among her many other honors include an award from the Radio and Television News Directors Association, the Goldsmiths Career Award from the Harvard's Joan Shorenstein Center. She's listed in the Hall of Fame of the National Association of Black Journalists, and she's a member of Ebony Magazine's list of the 150 most influential African Americans. The title of her talk today is Politics, Policy, and Reality, 3 words you don't see together very often. What's really going on in Washington? So please join me in welcoming Gwen Ifill.
It is true you do not see those words together much, and I'm not certain I'm going to clear it up for you tonight, but I'm going to try. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, for inviting me here and then dogging me until I agreed to come. You recognize that, do you? and saying, but the election will be over by then, which seemed like a reasonable idea, but that was before we knew about the fiscal cliff. I have to say that when you think about it, I am happy just to have the opportunity to escape Washington, if only for an evening. The smell of gridlock in the air there right now is quite overwhelming. And there's a game of chicken. Maybe it's fried chicken that I smell. It's playing out on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. We have been tiptoeing up to the edge of this fiscal cliff since the moment the election ended. Some would say we were tiptoeing up before, but no one was noticing. That's the yearly showdown that lawmakers seem to set up for themselves. It feels like every single year we have threats of gridlock, and this is what it takes for them to force themselves to do something about taxes and spending that will not send us lurching backward into recession. You may have heard it before. Now, it's not going so well at the moment, which could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. We have seen these gauntlets thrown before. We have seen the ultimatums issued. We have seen the dire warnings. They have all been duly noted. So it's hard to know what to take seriously. What does it mean, for instance, that lawmakers began leaving town for the weekend yesterday? John Boehner didn't seek the president out at the Christmas party. What did that mean? We're looking for any kinds of signs we can find. What does it mean that House Republicans began using the word nowhere to describe the state of negotiations last weekend and have been using that same word every day since? And what does it mean that the president seems to be talking to everyone else, to voters at rallies, to governors at the White House, to business leaders, except to the members of the House? Those in the know confidently predict one of two things. We're either headed over the cliff, as Secretary of Treasury Timothy Geithner said would happen by year's end, or we are headed toward another classic Washington pre-holiday midnight deal. Both could be right. I cannot say except to assure you that my holiday will not be ruined by these people. You probably find these high noon moments, which seem to roll around too much like clockwork, as exasperating as I find them, but I believe they can also provide a handy way to understand why things do and do not happen in Washington, the politics, the policy, and the reality, I guess. It's my job to try to understand, and moments like this, on the heels of years like this, remind me actually why I love what I do, because I do get to explain. Just when the rest of you are throwing up your hands in despair, convinced that what happens in Washington has nothing to do with what your lives are, it is my job, it's my opportunity to provide you with an explanation of why that is not necessarily true. I'll come back to the fiscal cliff issue in a moment, which surely shows the nation's capital at its least flattering. But let's talk first about this election just passed. I wonder if you're all feeling ignored now without all the robocalls and the ads. No? You're missing them? You kind of go home and look at the phone and stop blinking, you're upset. Pennsylvania wasn't quite the battlefield that some other states were, even though I heard an interesting little tidbit last week at a campaign managers conference in which the Republicans said they actually were serious about coming after Pennsylvania. They just didn't expect the turnout in suburban Philadelphia, so it's your fault. But I know a couple of other states which would have been happy to trade places with you in any case. I must be going through withdrawal, or something like it, because I still can't stop talking about an election that told us so much about America. It's been a year. I have been all over the country, from Florida to South Carolina to Ohio to Iowa to Ohio to Colorado to Ohio to Missouri, Indiana, Massachusetts, Ohio. And everywhere I go, I spend my time trying to make sense of this country, not just of the choices that people have, but also what our nation is thinking. And I do this not necessarily by talking to Washington pundits. There are enough of them talking to one another. I like to talk to voters. They're the ones who get to decide what actually happens on Election Day. Every year, though, every 4 years, like clockwork, every 2 years when we're covering the midterm elections, people eventually turn to me and they ask me, but don't you just get sick of all this? My answer is actually no. I do get discouraged at the tone. I get put off by voter apathy, and I get weary when the travel grows too hectic and the nights grow too long. But when it comes to watching democracy in action, I never tire of telling the story. You say there are long lines at polling places? Bring it on. Unresolved legal challenges? Allow us to explain. Spin and counterspin? Dig deeper. I just want to dig deeper. Even the endless blizzard of polls don't bother me, because when they're used correctly, I believe that they can give us a way to understand and discover what Americans believe and what they are willing to do about it. I discovered early in my career that understanding politics was a useful way of understanding the world. Whether our children get educated, where we choose to live, how healthy we get to be, who we get to know, it all boils down to politics. My first serious writing job working for the Boston Herald-American was covering the school department, the school committee in Boston, right in the middle of the busing crisis. I thought it was just about covering the schools. I discovered I was covering politics when my first day on the beat, they fired the superintendent and I couldn't tell what they had just said. Fortunately, a reporter walked out of the room, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You might want to file a story. I think it's a page 1." But I didn't begin covering presidential politics until I got to the Washington Post. In the beginning of my career there, I was a national political reporter. I was so far down on the totem pole. I was working in the shadows of the greats like David Broder and Paul Taylor and Dan Baltz. Only Kathleen Hull-Jamieson would return my phone calls. And I was always off to cover the losing candidates. This means that after a few months of this, I would walk into a campaign event and the candidates would quake to see me appear. I was like the political angel of death. Surely if they were being taken seriously, I would not have been there. So, because they wouldn't necessarily talk to me, or they would flee from me actually, I contented myself with talking to voters who came to see the candidates, who then and now almost always have more interesting things to say. I discovered one important thing. That was my first presidential election, 1988, that these voters were more alike than the candidates gave them credit for. Among my losing candidates I covered that year was Jesse Jackson on the left and Pat Robertson on the right. And I would go to their rallies not knowing what to expect, only to discover that their voters, the people who came to hear them speak, were more alike than different. Some were Democrat, some were Republican, most were white in one room, most were black in the other room. But they shared this idea that no one was speaking to their concerns about their families. They were both groups of people who were rooted in the church and wanted someone to speak to them. And when I discovered that they had more in common than different in their grievances and what they wanted and what they were asking for from their leaders, I began to listen more closely to what they had to say. In subsequent election years, I started climbing up the slippery pole a little bit, managing to actually cover a winning candidate, Bill Clinton, from beginning to end, and all the banana peels in between, and through his first 2 years in the White House. Now, and it's been 7 presidential campaigns later, now that this one is over, I operate most of the time from kind of a distance, a little bit removed, sitting in an anchor chair and only occasionally getting out on the campaign trail. And although this election year has taken me all over the country, technology has actually made it simpler for me to follow the candidates at a distance and to keep track of their surrogates. I find the questions, however, that I had at the beginning of my political reporting career are not so different from the ones I have now. There are questions best asked of the voters themselves. Which candidate is speaking to your hopes, your fears? How optimistic are you about your family's future, about its present? Have you ever voted for different parties in successive elections? If so, what motivated you to change? How much faith do you invest in government to improve your life or to make your life worse? These seem like pretty basic questions, but they endure from cycle to cycle. Ronald Reagan won election by speaking to voters' hopes while reminding them of their fears. Bill Clinton won by repeatedly changing the topic from his own shortcomings to Americans' concerns. Don't worry what they say about me, it's what we're doing for you. George W. Bush successfully made the argument that government could be curtailed while still remaining compassionate. Covering these candidates and others, I've been fortunate to see the nation exercise its franchise in parking lots and raucous rallies and airport tarmacs and diners and front stoops and living rooms. I've been able to relate what I see for the Washington Post, the New York Times, NBC News, and for the last 4 cycles, the PBS NewsHour and Washington Week. This year, I discovered that the presidential choice was a pretty stark one. One candidate was the well-heeled product of a prosperous and deeply religious family. The other was the son of a fleetingly present mother and an entirely absent father. One could trace his roots unerringly through the generations. The other came from a mixed bag of heritage, mother from Kansas, father from Kenya, raised in Indonesia and Hawaii. Mitt Romney met his wife when she was 15, and he married her 4 years later, after taking a break to become a Mormon missionary. Barack Obama met his wife in Chicago, the latest of his series of adopted hometowns, after both were already pursuing adult careers as lawyers. The differences between the two men continued: career choice, political worldview. I have to confess, even though I'd been covering them both for a while, it didn't really come clear to me until one night when I turned on Frontline and watched The Choice. That's when I saw the actual juxtaposition. So I kept wondering, what was so hard for people? Why was choosing between these very different candidates so difficult? The first answer to that question, of course, is that for the vast majority of our deeply divided country, it was not difficult at all. For some, of course, it was. I heard a campaign manager say after the election was over that, in fact, one of the interesting things about this election was that they decided to spend all of their money in the spring. This is the Democrats. All their money in the spring instead of the fall, because by the time they started watching debate, most people will have made up their own minds. Everywhere I traveled, I met voters. And I kept thinking, who is this elusive, undecided voter? I was convinced they did not exist. And then I ran into a woman named Maura Fletcher at a pumpkin rally. Actually, it was an apple cider festival in Lakewood, Colorado. This is why I love my job. She and her husband, it turns out, run a small chiropractic business in this swingiest of swing counties outside of in a swing state in Jefferson County, Colorado. They're parents to an 11-month-old son. Neither is a native Coloradan, and in fact, they weren't even living in the country 4 years ago when the big choice was made in the big historic election. So they were starting from scratch and trying to decide what they thought. So she was still trying to figure out which of these two candidates. It was deep into October by the time we met. And she confessed, well, you know, for me, nothing happens without a deadline. She turned out to be just the kind of voter all of the exit polls show determined the outcome of the election. She liked Governor Romney because she appreciated his approach to business. She liked President Obama because she supported his stance on reproductive rights and issues involving women. So I pressed her, which of these things would make up your mind in the end? Which carried more weight? And she said to me, the women's issues versus the business, I can't put a weight on that. She said, small business is our livelihood, and it provides for my husband and I and my son. And the women's issues, she said, I'm a gentle feminist, so I can't say one would outweigh the other. The exit polls showed after the election that it was women just like her who determined the outcome, and that they leaned toward Barack Obama in the end. The reasons are kind of complicated, but they always come back to the same basic question. Who will be best for me? In 2004, I went to a swing county in a swing state in Ohio in search of the same type of voter. And I was in a Piggly Wiggly or some such place, walking down the aisles looking for voters who wouldn't see me coming with my camera run the other way. And I came across a guy who was wearing a bomber jacket, and it said on it that he was with the United Steelworkers. And he was kind of middle-aged, balding, and I don't know, looked kind of a tough guy. But he looked like a big union guy. So I said to him, assuming that I knew the answer, who are you supporting? And he said, George W. Bush. And I said, really? Why is that? He said, I kind of trust him. Now, I wasn't smart enough at the time to realize what I was figuring out then. But when I looked back at the exit polls after that election, I discovered that people just like him had said in the end decided they didn't quite warm to John Kerry. And they were the kind of voters who went the other way and voted for the Republican. So this year, both President Obama and Governor Romney honed their closing arguments into kind of a streamlined version of that final question, who will be best for me? Government's role. Should government be focused on cutting taxes, boosting the private sector, and essentially getting out of the way? Or can government use its big stick to regulate and expand the social contract? This debate proved to be central to several turning points throughout the campaign. There were the raucous Republican primaries that occupied all of Mitt Romney's time while President Obama was quietly rebuilding and reinforcing his 2008 coalition. I know a Republican strategist who said after the election was over, you know, it cost us $135 million to get through our primaries, and he got his for free. Yeah, well, you know. Then there were the self-inflicted errors from other Republican candidates. Remember legitimate rape? That really wasn't about the presidential race, or was it? And from the candidate himself, that 47% tape didn't go over so well. Oddly enough, last I checked, he ended up with 47% of the vote. But one thing I did not predict is how much those presidential debates would matter. Going back to what David Axelrod said, which is that people had made up their minds, the other thing he said that was interesting was, you know, we basically engage in propaganda. That's what we do. But by the time you got to the fall, voters wanted to make up their minds with their own eyes, and that's where the debates came in. For many voters, these widely watched, broadly televised contests kind of served to focus the mind. Seeing those men, and so far they've always been men, who would be president, standing face-to-face, side-by-side, empowers viewers to finally decide for themselves. They were an important part of the political diet this year, like the ads, the rallies, and the white papers. They often did as much to confirm impressions as to alter perceptions. If you think back, however, through the debates that we have as part of our memory bank, it's possible that it didn't work out the way we remember. I mean, did George H.W. Bush, glancing at his watch, really persuade voters that he couldn't be president and that they should vote for Bill Clinton? Or did it confirm the worst suspicions that so many of them already had? Did Lloyd Bentsen, dismissing Dan Quayle as no Jack Kennedy, win the election for Michael Dukakis? I think not. Or did it speak to an existing worry that Bush lacked the judgment to pick a number two who could assume the presidency? Minds were already made up. I've had the opportunity to moderate a few debates, and looking back on this year's, these three distinctly different encounters, plus the vice presidential debate, which was different again, I can say that in the end, I don't think that the moderators mattered all that much. What came out of the candidates' mouths did. This year, every moderator had a different approach, from laid back to reasonably aggressive. I argue it allowed voters to see the full range of these candidates. I have to confess to you, I went to church a few Sundays ago, and right after that first debate, when Barack Obama didn't do so well, and my pastor all of a sudden called out from the pulpit, "Gwen Ifill." And I thought, oh, Lord. You see, my dad's a preacher, so whenever that happened, it was not good. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, you know, if you had moderated that debate, President Obama would have done better. And I said to him, I don't believe I was the candidate. And that's exactly what it came down to, the candidate. The voters got to see the full range of the candidates. And in the end, they were judged on their own performances, not on what the moderators did or didn't do. My approach in 2004 and in 2008 was to kind of take it as it came. In 2004, you'll remember it was John Edwards and Dick Cheney, who it should be said I would have different questions for today. Both of them. But you'll remember that John Edwards slyly slipped a mention of Dick Cheney's daughter's sexual orientation into the answer to an unrelated question. And that was something which annoyed Dick Cheney no end. And then in 2008, you'll remember that Sarah Palin at one point blithely assured the 67 million viewers who were watching that it was not really her responsibility to answer the moderator's questions. In both cases, I had an option. I could have jumped on John Edwards and saying, what are you doing? How could you do that? Or I could have said to Sarah Palin, what? And I could have done that, but I concluded that in each case I had two choices. I could raise my eyebrows and roll my neck and express my outrage and perhaps even bang on the table a little bit. Certainly Geraldo would have done that. This would, however, have been making it about me and not about the candidates. My other option was to leave it up to the candidate's opponent in each case to call them on answers they ducked and on questions they didn't answer. And I decided to take the second option because after all, there were two candidates on the stage and that was your purpose, to see them and to hear them interact with each other as much as possible. I also have another theory about the worth of debates, which is that in the age of Twitter and Facebook, blogs, and opinionated cable news, debates are no longer the last best chance for candidates to define themselves. It turns out Saturday Night Live is. Whether it's Tina Fey as Sarah Palin, Amy Poehler as Hillary Clinton, or Jason Sudeikis as Mitt Romney and Joe Biden, a dead-on impersonation that lampoons a candidate's weakest, most cartoonish qualities manages to leave a nasty mark. Gerald Ford was actually a gifted athlete, but Chevy Chase convinced us he was a bumbling buffoon. Bill Clinton is as skilled a politician as I have ever met, has ever graced the national stage, but Darrell Hammond spawned a winking Clinton impersonators, which I could do, but I won't. Portraying him as a leering man of untamed appetites. In 2004, when I moderated the Cheney-Edwards debate, the SNL spoof happened to feature that week's guest host, lucky for me, Queen Latifah. Now, lucky for me because the other options in that case would have involved a black man in drag, or a woman in blackface. It was not a good option. But by 2008, when it rolled around, I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know if I was going to do another debate. And in the interim, I had actually met Queen Latifah at a film screening in Washington, and I had joked to her that maybe next time she could play me again. And her reply was, sure, if there's material. And then John McCain picked Sarah Palin. Her presence on the stage in 2008 and my return as moderator provided plenty enough material. And to this day, whenever I step foot on a college campus, everybody waits and waits and waits. And then they finally ask me the question, which is, how'd you feel about Queen Latifah playing you? And I always reply, are you kidding? This woman is a cover girl. I'm perfectly happy. It's as good as it's ever going to get for me. Besides, how would anyone even remember I was ever on the stage? Moderators don't matter. As you can tell, I love politics. I even confess to loving politicians because most of the ones I meet are really about representing people, representing an idea, and they are about the jobs that the people elect them to serve. But they allow me to actually talk to voters and ask them questions, and then key, by the way, in my business, to listen to the answers. I listen, I probe, and I remain convinced that no matter what you read, see, and hear out there, serious journalism still matters. It's all I ever wanted to do. I believe that there is nobility in telling untold stories and in shedding light rather than heat on all the overtold ones. Most of the people I know got into journalism kind of to save the world. We had this idea that we were going to make things better, and then we realized, it dawned on us slowly, that we might have to save the world from us. Which brings me to my time in public broadcasting, where we do more with less on a daily basis. It means resisting the undeniable lure of a Lindsay Lohan story one day or a Princess Kate's pregnancy story the next. But there are plenty of places where you can find that, and there's nothing wrong. I know that you are all sneaking little peeks at it, so it's okay. Those yellow flowers she was holding coming out of the hospital today touched my heart. But our mission in public broadcasting is to educate rather than titillate. At this point in my career, as you heard, I've worked for newspapers, I've worked at a commercial network, and now at public broadcasting, we're like clockwork. We are periodically accused by those on the left of being biased and those of the right on being biased, and Big Bird comes under unfair assault. But many of those critics of what we do don't actually listen to or watch what we do. This is what we do. In the finest tradition of public broadcasting, we listen, we try to understand. If we don't understand, we ask again, and then we explain. So this has been a particularly gratifying year for that. I like the horse race, I have to confess, but I love the voters. That means that the Tea Party movement on the right and the Occupy Wall Street protesters on the left are both good for democracy. It's silence that corrupts. I believe that PBS is the best place to do all of that, to understand, to ask, to explain. It's where I can do my job best, where I can ask questions, press for the answers, and where the audience is more likely to want the information that allows them to make up their own minds rather than to demand that someone tell them what to think. On Washington Week and the NewsHour, we don't much yell. We don't do that. In fact, we don't invite you back if you yell. But we do approach the news with a fairly simple premise. We assume that you can decide what you think, and the deal is that we will give you the information to work with. But we believe that you are hungry to know, that the rigors of daily life do not entirely obliterate the need for information that extends beyond your front yard, which brings me back to the fiscal cliff. Here is why it matters. Sure, your taxes could go up, so that matters. And yes, the nation's deficit is unsustainable, so yes, that matters. But I would also argue that how this sorts itself out will tell us a lot about the quality of the people we have chosen to lead us. Can they split the difference in an honorable way? Which wings of their political parties are driving outcomes? What did the American people really say in this year's election? And who is in greater danger of over-interpreting that message or under-interpreting it? And what does that mean for the next 4 years? Getting the answers to these questions is far from easy. We have to be alert to nuance. We're not good at nuance often in my business, but we should be. And we have to be alert to true meaning. And although we have different tools to get to the answers to some of these questions, they remain basically the same as when I first began working as a journalist more than, oh, is this mic out? I was going to say, okay, more than 30 years ago. I grew up believing passionately in the power of the news to tell a story, which means when I was living in Buffalo, New York, if the Buffalo Evening News ran a picture saying there was still a Santa Claus, and I was way too old to believe in Santa Claus, but they ran that little wire picture saying there is the Santa in his sleigh, I would continue to believe. And on the other hand, if Chet Huntley and Walter Cronkite told me someone had just assassinated the President of the United States, well, I learned there was sober reality to be absorbed as well. But who knew, even though all I wanted to be was a newspaper reporter, who knew that by now newspapers would be struggling, they would be contracting. The television news divisions would be placing all of their bets on your ability to get your information by cell phone, and that I would actually be reading more of my news online than in print. That's why I believe there's a role for public broadcasting, more of a role than ever. That in 35 years of the NewsHour and 45 years of Washington Week, we're just getting started. At the one-year anniversary of the Gulf oil spill, we looked back and we counted that we had done 232 stories on the topic. And we no longer tell the story just on the air. We had a little online oil spill widget which kept track of how many gallons of oil were being spilled into the Gulf. And that was embedded on more than 6,000 websites around the world, and it was viewed more than 20 million times. We are convinced that telling the story well and in as many ways as we can still matters. The people around my Washington Week table, I call it my sandbox because I invite my friends to play. They're the smartest reporters in Washington. They are not arm's length from the story. They are in the middle of the story. And they are there to explain why things happen and why they matter. Now, if it sounds like I'm boasting a little bit here, it's because I am. We are justifiably proud of what we do and are convinced that even in a dramatically shifting media environment, there is hunger for the work that we do. But I always look forward to getting out, to visiting college campuses where students will invariably say to me, I only watch Jon Stewart. And I reply to them, well, that's good because Jon Stewart watches me. I don't say that just because it's true. I say it because in order to laugh at a Jon Stewart joke, you have to know who Nancy Pelosi is. You have to have the information in order to get the comedy. Because not only did Jon Stewart watch our show, but so did Walter Cronkite, and that was about information. And that's because journalism, even faux journalism, can only flourish when it has a firm foundation. So that's what we do. That's what more of us can do, honestly. And on days like today, I'm reminded how many people are actually doing it well. I get to judge journalism contest from time to time, and it restores my faith that many of us are out there digging deep and digging hard. We might not be saving the world, but at least we're making it a more understandable place to live. I hope it's working because there's less than 4 years to the next election. Thank you so much for having me. I'd love to take your questions now. Now, just don't be shy. Just plunge right in. See, right in the back. Hi.
I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
Okay. I was wondering if you could give us an update on your assessment of what is going on with Obama and the Republicans with regard to the fiscal crisis.
You know, I've been out of town for a minute, so, but I can pretty much guess that nothing has happened today. The last that we heard yesterday was that they talked. They had a conversation. That John Boehner and the president talked. We don't know what they talked about. Then last night on the NewsHour, we had Senator John Cornyn from Tennessee who said he felt there was movement, but we didn't know what he based it on. Basically, it's going to work out this way. Right after an election, both sides then test each other to see, okay, who really has the mandate here and how far can I push them? So the first thing that comes out is, we're happy to cooperate. Let's all cooperate. Kumbaya. Then the next week it becomes, well, wait a second. I still have my standards because by then someone in the background has pushed back at you. And then they begin to negotiate. So they lay out, both of them as of this week, came out with completely unacceptable alternatives, which they knew the other wouldn't accept, and then begin to inch closer to the middle. And two things will then happen. They'll either come up with a late-breaking, midnight agreement that, well, three things could happen. A real agreement, two, an agreement that kicks the can down the road and they fix part of it but not the rest of it, probably the tax rate issue, or the Bush era tax cuts. And three, that we just go over the cliff and the whole thing is a disaster. I know that there is so much pressure coming from the business community, which is so unhappy about the uncertainty that this provides, that is something both Democrats and Republicans agree on, that they don't want to tick off the business community because it affects our economy. It's not just that they're beholden to business, but it means that we are still on the lip of recovering from this recession. We're going to get new jobs numbers tomorrow, and we're going to find out whether, in fact, we're still gaining jobs. Nobody wants to set that back. So then it becomes a political question of who can better take the blame. And so far, the polls I've read all show that the president has the upper hand, but we'll see. We've still got a couple of more steps to go in that dance. Yes?
Why is there such a gridlock in Washington? Why is there more hate than love?
I don't know if there's more hate than love, but there's certainly more politics than policy much of the time. I still think a lot gets done in Washington. I do believe that this year has been incredibly hostile in some respects. And I would blame some in the news media for some of it. We have all retreated to our corners where you can turn on the news in the morning and turn it off at night and only listen to people with whom you agree. And you will never have to hear the other side of the story. One of the most interesting things that happened election night was the genuine shock on the part of the Romney forces that they had lost. And part of the reason they were shocked is because they hadn't heard a dissenting opinion in 10 months. They had only listened to the polls they wanted to listen to the commentators they wanted to listen to. And I would argue that Democrats, except for being more pessimistic by nature, would have been just as shocked as well. So I don't think I think there's a certain, that the true breakthrough in terms of getting through gridlock has to be about people getting used to talking to one another once again, and we're not quite there yet. Yes, sir.
I would like to hear your understanding of why Republicans are so stubbornly resisting the popular American sentiment that people who make over $250,000 should be taxed high. I mean, as politicians, why?
Because their argument is that that raising taxes on anyone would set us back, that it would set the economy back, that it would restore uncertainty among job creators. That's their argument. Yeah.
You seem very positive in your speech about like both the state of journalism and the state of democracy. Mm-hmm. So I was like, I'm thinking that the narrative that we usually hear is that both are in crisis, both have so many problems around them, whether like democracy turning into like this messy identity politics or journalism with the rise of like Fox News and so like do you
And MSNBC. Let's be fair here.
But do you agree that that's your characterization? Do you think that pessimistic narrative is false? What are your thoughts?
I'm not a naturally pessimistic person. I don't think I could do my job if I expected the worst outcomes. I also think that the truth of politics is that a lot of this is positioning. A lot of these guys, one of the great things I like to say about Washington is, oh, back in the old days, these guys used to drink together and everything was fine. Well, no, they drank together, but everything wasn't necessarily fine. There was still politics. Politics was still alive and well back in the great old days, which were never so great, but were certainly old. So I'm not at the point where I think things are as terrible as they've ever been and that they're unrescuable. For instance, when it comes to the future of journalism, I think that journalism, as I grew up, to aspire to is probably never going to be that way again. When people ask me if they should go into newspapers, I say sure, but have a backup plan. I never used to say that. But I also believe there are a million different platforms that exist to practice journalism that didn't exist when I got into this business. It didn't occur to me that I could write a blog. It didn't occur to me that there would be that ProPublica, which exists entirely online, would do some of the best investigative journalism that exists. And when I tell people about it, when they say, oh, there's no more investigative journalism, I say, yes, there is. You just have to look at a different place. Same thing with politics and politicians. You just have to hold them accountable in a different way, and that's what elections do. Yes.
Do you have any guesses as to who might run for president in 2016? My follow-up question.
Don't make me.
My follow-up question. When do you think there might be a viable female candidate that is taken seriously? And do you have any thoughts on that in general?
So you want to know, is Hillary going to run again in 2016? I'm very good at this. You know, when I wrote my book 4 years ago about the breakthrough of African-American candidates, the one question I got a lot when I traveled on the book tour was, what about women? And when is there going to be a women's breakthrough? And I realized I had a chapter about women, but I realized I had trouble with it because halfway through the book, I thought to myself, I don't have enough women in this book. Let me see if I can find some women breakthroughs. And everywhere I looked, I had the hardest time. And so I started asking why, all the smartest women I knew who do politics. And their answers were interesting. Part of it is that women serve to lead in different ways, not necessarily in elective politics. They don't necessarily like to raise the money or knock on the doors. A part of it is but that doesn't mean they're not leading. They may be leading a nonprofit organization and making a difference that way. And part of it is that women like to be asked and men pound the door down. And so and that won't necessarily always happen in politics. Now, we now have a new generation, I would say, of women. We do not have to always look back to poor Hillary, who needs a break. But we have a whole generation of women who really do want to be engaged. But here's the reality of it. All of the women that we think of as female leaders and possible potential are women who have finished raising their families. And that's why they can think about it. Women prioritize differently. And so when you think about Nancy Pelosi becoming the first female Speaker of the House, she was also grandmother of dozens, I think. When you think about Hillary Clinton talking about running for president, she's 65 years old. Her daughter's an adult. This is what often happens, is that when women have taken care of one section of their lives, they then compartmentalize it and pursue another kind of section. Now, when we get to the point where we get women who can keep all of these balls in the air, Debbie Wasserman Schultz has small children at home and is running the DNC, it is possible this will happen, but we're waiting to see. There are a lot more women on the horizon, on the next layer, which are interesting to watch, which I'm keeping an eye on, people like Susana Martinez, the governor of New Mexico. And I want to see where they go with that and whether that takes us to the next level and whether it will even matter by the time they do it that they're female. Yes?
You've mentioned your passion for speaking to voters, but also suggested that some voters may be reticent to speak with you, especially on camera. So
can you imagine such a thing in this space?
the horror. So as a journalist, how do you find the balance between presenting the views of individuals who may be very interested in presenting those views to the public and those who are more reticent to present their opinions?
Well, the one thing I do not do is just wander the street looking for a voter to talk to me. We go to places, we do a lot of reporting before we go someplace. We say, for instance, the woman I talked about who I met in Colorado, we knew what the voting numbers were, we know what the polls showed in that particular district, in that particular municipality, and that if we went to a public event there, we are more likely to find a voter like her. We were looking for someone to fit a story that we knew existed because we had done our research and talked to people and talked to pollsters and people who were familiar with the area. So we were more likely to find that. And then I have a little trick. I stand still and let them find me, because if they watch public television, they're really smart people. I swear. They are more likely to have thought about it, to have thought it through, to want to talk to me, and it makes my job and my producer's job so much easier. That sounds like a cheap shot, but it's true. Yes, sir.
Last 3 election cycles, as you've traveled the country, what have you learned about the appetite for public media in particular?
It's selective, like everything. The best part we have going for us is that we're free, that we're in broadcast and not on cable. So if you want it, the more rural an area, the more popular I am. I find I'm huge in Montana. But also, I find that the people who are consumers of public media are usually consumers across the line. They listen to NPR as well as watch Frontline and the NewsHour and Washington Week. They want their information in big doses like that, and that's kind of helpful for us to find out who they are. I also spent a fair amount of time going to public television stations, talking to our supporters, because I've always got that tote bag in hand, Hey, please. And as a result, I get a sense of the value that people place in public broadcasting. They're community stations often. Often they're based at universities, or they are the only station in an entire state that covers the state house. So people have an investment in public broadcasting, which I try to feed. Yes?
Hi. I wanted to ask you, so I'm going to ask, as a woman of color, the woman of color question.
Just go ahead and give me the woman of color. It would be nice if some of the rest of you had asked that.
I was waiting for it, but I didn't hear. Being at PBS, right, so I'm going to ask the question about kind of the 2 elements at PBS. So besides the people who are in front of the camera, behind the camera, it's awfully white, right? It's awfully white in the production companies, at Moyers and Company, at Now, that there are rarely people of color behind the scenes who are helping write the scripts and produce the pieces. And so I guess one of the questions is, like, we're talking about journalism, we're kind of talking about the performance of politics in terms of the White House, and we have a black president, and we have more black people in front of the camera, but actual journalism in terms of at least broadcast.
You're hitting my pet peeve, my dear.
It's monolithic, right? It's very monolithic. And so the stories become redundant, and particularly at PBS, right? It's like every time somebody turns around, it's, oh, we should do this story. Well, our viewers won't like it. It's like, well, all your viewers are 75, right? I mean, it's kind of the same.
Okay, let me agree and disagree. No, I think for your tell she worked with Bill Moyer's show, but I see what your point is, because there's a larger question here which is beyond PBS, which is where my pet peeve is, and then there's the PBS part. I actually think PBS in general, and I can't speak for show to show, does a far more inclusive job of telling the stories of America, whether it's Ken Burns or whether it's Frontline or whether it's us, than most other news. There are no other than any network, basically. But our business in general is pretty awful when it comes to that. I have been in newsrooms where my defense of diversity is this, that it's not just diversity of skin color or gender, it's diversity of thought and idea and background. And I think that in any newsroom, every newsroom in America starts their day by having a meeting in which they say, is this a good story, is that a good story? And if all the people around that table went to Harvard, their idea of what a good, black or white or green, their idea of a good story is defined by their vision of what the world is. If everybody around that table had exactly the same background, you just don't have a mix. When I worked at the Washington Post, I remember covering a big housing scandal at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it struck me one day, I was probably the only reporter on that beat who had ever lived in public housing, and therefore had a different sense of who these people were who lived in public housing and depended on it. I think it remains incredibly important, not just in public television or in television, but in journalism in general. We have a responsibility to tell as many stories as broadly as possible. And we can only do that by bringing in people who might see it right in front of them. And we don't do a good enough job, not by a long shot. Catherine?
When we set up factcheck.org, we did it in part because we thought it might be helpful to journalists to have an institutionalized function in which people systematically evaluated things journalists might not be able to do as quickly when they were writing on the fly and reporting on the fly. This year there's been a sustained attack on the fact-checking enterprise. The question is it of use to journalists? Is it of use to anyone? What do you think about this controversy?
I think that fact-checking, I was talking to Brooks Jackson briefly before, fact-checking there's more fact-checking than ever. When I first started in this business, it was a novel idea. Oh, let's see if it's true what they said in this ad. And then we would go out there and we try to do it ourselves. And then over time, some newspapers started their own fact-check sections, and then factcheck.org started. And there are other places to go to get the information. My frustration is not that journalists don't use it or report it, even though I'm sure that's true. My frustration is that even if you do use it and report it, that the candidates say, "And your point?" You say, "That's not true." And they say, "Well, yeah." And as I was saying, and they repeat it. And I don't know quite how to get around that, except that it's part of my larger thought about how we consume information, not just news, but information now, which is that the responsibility is so much more on the voter than it is on the media. We can put it out there, we can serve it up, and if you don't consume it, there's very little we can do. If we call a candidate to account and the candidate has no shame, then what other tool do we have? There's nothing illegal, just unethical about what they're doing and saying so often. And that, to me, is the great frustration. We have this wonderful idea where we think if we tell the truth, they will just have to bow to us. Well, no, it turns out. I don't know if that will always be the case, but I know that I was a little taken aback by how frequently it was the case this year. Yes?
I'm always curious as to how a moderator prepares to moderate a debate. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you prepare?
It's really hard. I'll tell you about 2008 because it was a unique and interesting year. When I started moderating debates, I went to the king of all debate moderation, Jim Lehrer, and said, "What should I do?" He said, "Keep it all to yourself." And he was right, because the truth is that all the candidates spend all of their time. I heard today that Romney did 16 debate prep sessions. 16 moot debates in preparation. And trust me, a big part of that is figuring out what the moderator is going to ask, what the moderator is going to say. So my responsibility is to keep it to myself and to not let them know. I was so paranoid about this that when I moderated the Cheney-Edwards debate, I discovered to my horror that my hotel room was on the opposite end of the hall from Edwards, so I would sneak in and out like this. So I wouldn't be seen in the hallway by staffers saying, "Hey, Gwen," I'd go, "What?" And I'd hide because I was so nervous about it. When I got to St. Louis to do the Palin-Biden debate, there were people always lurking mysteriously in the hallway outside of my room. People saying they needed to check the wallpaper in my room. I mean, there was a lot of deep, weird stuff going on. So I was very nervous about the secrecy. But prior to getting there, I would prepare everything in my home, basically on my own. 3x5 cards out the wazoo, hundreds of questions, which I would pare down and then expand again, then pare down, then put in order, then switch up, and then at the last minute think, "Oh, what happened today? I've got to change that." That was hard. That was complicated. That took all of my waking hours and unwaking. I dream of questions, and people would send me questions. I got about 50 questions sent to my house mysteriously about a single issue. Someone had found my home address. But in 2008, the night before I was supposed to fly to St. Louis, I was done with all my work. It was my birthday. I was so proud of myself. I walked down the stairs, fell, and broke my ankle. And so I spent that night, lovely me, in the emergency room as my ankle got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they put a big splint on it and said, "Don't you have to be somewhere?" And I said, "Yes, I do, doctor." And so I got on a plane, got on a wheelchair, got on some crutches, and flew to St. Louis. And my concern was because there was a big dust-up, you may recall, just before that debate about me and about whether I was going to be fair because I was writing a book that had Obama's name in the title, so therefore I must clearly be an Obama partisan. Never mind, this was a vice presidential debate. It didn't matter. It was the beginning of a lot of what we saw in the moderator assassination this year, which was they had to make it about something else other than the candidates. But in addition to, I was under attack on the cable networks and on the blogs, and Drudge had a field day, I'm told, because I stopped reading it all. But I couldn't walk either, because I didn't know how to use these crutches. So they figure out this deal to get me on the stage, which is they built an elevator to get me to the stage, backstage. And then these two football players named Buck and Tim from WashU, it was the best part of my day, helped me onto the stage where they had built a little thing for me to put my leg up underneath, and I could not take pain medication because I thought they'd say I was on drugs. But adrenaline is a wonderful thing, and I got through the debate on Advil. And so when people say things like, Sarah Palin said, "Can I call you Joe?" I said, "She did?" Right over my head. But what I was most concerned about was that in the end, when it was all done, people would say she was fair. And no one would overinterpret anything I did or didn't do. And it worked out fine. And then I went home and had I think 7 screws and a plate put in my ankle. And it didn't dry for 6 weeks. It was all worth it. All worth it. Harder than it had to be, in other words. Yes.
Gwen, as a Republican strategist, study the demographics of this recent defeat, and considering the 8 years that will pass an Obama administration, what do you think that they will be doing in the next 4 years to change their message, to expand their base?
It's already begun. This week, we saw Paul Ryan and Marco Rubio, who are arguably the face of the party, the face of the future of the party, give a speech at a Jack Kemp dinner in Washington, which tells you all you need to know. Somewhere Jack Kemp is laughing. And they both talked about how the party needed to move away from this idea. In fact, Paul Ryan came as close as possible as saying this 47% comment was a boneheaded thing. And Marco Rubio, who is a very compelling speaker and actually someone I've been keeping my eye on for a while, talked about how the party is dead without figuring out a way to expand its base when it comes to immigration issues. They hurt themselves so badly in the primaries and immigration issues. For so many Latino voters, it didn't occur to them that even though they themselves might not be people who were here illegally, that they might have an auntie or a grandmother or an uncle or a cousin who was. And therefore, even though the economy was a big issue, immigration was a gateway issue for a lot of these voters, and they are growing and growing and growing. So they know that they fatally miscalculated the Latino vote. They knew they could not compete nationally on it, partly because Obama. I was in Colorado in the spring, which has a huge and growing Latino community, and the Obama people already had 14 offices open in the state, and Romney had none. I mean, they were always ahead of them on that curve. And so that's part of the expanding the base. I think there's just a lot of, this always happens after you lose, a lot of navel gazing, a lot of rethinking going on in the party, and a lot of discussion among mainstream Republicans about how far they can afford to be pushed to the right and still survive in the next cycle.
Also, there's the largest gender gap, I believe, in the history of any election.
I don't know if that's true, but I do know.
I read that somewhere.
Yeah, well.
So we're getting close to being out of time. I'd like to ask one last question. You mentioned your 2009 book, and it sounds like when you were doing your chapter on women, someone should have brought you a binder full of women. But are there any lessons learned from this election about race that you?
That's a great question. You know, we spent so much time talking about race in the last election because the president was so clearly a first. And the first never happens a second time. So as a result, a lot of the historical heft was missing from this one. On the other hand, I do think, I like it when we get past the first. I like it when we stop asking that question about what it means, because it turns out, and this president in particular is a very race-conscious man, but he is, as you can tell, always leaned heavily against being defined completely by that. On the other hand, what I think is the most important part, and it has almost nothing to do with politics, except to the degree that everything has something to do with politics, that Americans need to find a way to talk about our differences without it being a hostile conversation. when I traveled around talking about the book, I was so interested because my audiences were 1/3 kind of Volvo driving white PBS people, 1/3 Volvo driving black PBS people, and 1/3 young people who thought I was Queen Latifah. But the interesting thing was these people never ever existed in the same room together. They never shared their ideas together. They lived in different silos. Even though they all like me, they never talked to each other. But when I talked to them about race, there were a couple things that would happen. One is that people would ask but aren't we past all that? Well, no, kind of. And here's a sign. If you come up to me at a party and say, oh, look, there's that guy over there, and you say, who? And you say, oh, you know, he's wearing a blue blazer and khakis. And you say, who? And they cannot bring themselves to describe him by the most descriptive feature, which is it's the black guy in the corner, the only other black person in the room. Why is that? Because we take race to be a negative. When I tell people I wake up in the morning and I'm really happy to be black, it would always take people aback. Really? Aren't you supposed to be burdened by that? No, I'm not burdened by it. I think it's kind of a great part of who I am, and whatever you are is a great part of who you are. And if we can find a way to have that conversation without grievance and accusation, then we will be a better country. We're getting there, but we're moving much more slowly than we think. And that's what I think Barack Obama's presence. Every now and then I'm a little taken aback. I see him walking around a helicopter. I'm like, we have a black president? When, what? I'm surprised all over again. So we're getting there, but we're a slow-moving people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, thank you all very much. I think you can see why we were excited to have Gwen come and speak to us tonight. For those of you who are attending the dinner, we'll be able to show you the way up to the fifth floor where we're holding this. For the rest of you, thank you very much for taking your time to be with us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.